First of all, I want to welcome back everyone from last night. We started this conference, Global Sexual Violence During Conflict from the Balkans to Africa and the Middle East. Yesterday afternoon, over in the School of Journalism, we had the great fortune of screening Anna Lellio's incredible film, Thinking of You, about the commemoration of sexual violence in Kosovo. And she's going to be talking today on this panel. But what I want to say is, and then we had the great fortune of listening to Madeline Reese last night, who titled her speech Inevitable or Constructed Sexual Violence, Men, Women, and War. And she presented, I think, a very compelling case, given that we can thank the bravery of Bosnian women for the international jurisprudence that has been produced on the crime of rape. Indeed, it is now an indictable offense in front of the International Criminal Court. We have convictions on rape as a crime against humanity. We also have convictions on rape that has led to upholding genocide, and it has also been accompanied in groundbreaking jurisprudence where enslavement was used in the cases, many of the cases that were adjudicated in front of the International War Crimes Tribunal of former Yugoslavia. So everything begins with Bosnia, tragically, but in terms of international jurisprudence, many good things have evolved, as Madeline pointed out to us. However, even though we have that jurisprudence, there are lots of problems, as we know, with convictions on rape, the lack of protection of witnesses, and in terms of reparations, many of the complications that have come from paying out reparations that always lead to the social and economic factors that follow in these post-war situations involving reforms required by the International Monetary Fund. And the first to get cut, as Madeline pointed out last night, many times are those who have been survivors of rape. So I think that one of the things she presented, and I'm going to bring it up again today, is grappling with the social and economic factors that are associated with the rise of militarism in the world and how that militarism is actually manifested in the crimes of mass rape that we are now witnessing or attempting to witness in the war in Syria, as an example, and we are going to be so fortunate to hear about that later this morning. So because everything started with the Balkans, we're going to start there, and I am delighted that we are joined today not only by Anna, who's done incredible work on this issue through her oral history project and film, but we're also joined by two young scholars and activists, Velma Saric, who is here today with us from Sarajevo, the Post-Conflict Research Center, where she's the executive director and one of the founders of that organization, and Edita Miftari, who is a Fulbright scholar at Clark University this year, who has done considerable work on gender in her, not only her master's, but also now as a Fulbright scholar. And lastly, we are delighted to also welcome Jennifer Trahan, who's on the faculty at NYU, a lawyer who's going to give us an overview about the law and how it factors into the Balkans. And I think actually I asked Jennifer to talk about really looking beyond the Balkans, perhaps, and laying out some of the international legal frameworks as we proceed into the later morning panel beginning at 11 o'clock. So with that, I'm going to ask Belinda Cooper to take over, our colleague from Columbia, the Institute for the Study of Human Rights, and also an NYU faculty member. And she is moderating this panel. I want to thank her so much. Over to you, Belinda.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you for this great conference. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of it, and thank you all for coming out this early in the morning. I'm not going to, we have 4 experts here, so I'm not going to save much more. Tanya already introduced the subject, so we can get started. Anna has to leave early, unfortunately, so she'll be the first, and then we'll just go in order. And I'm going to give each panelist maybe 10 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. I won't repeat the thanks, but I just go along with everything that has been said so far. When I was asked to be in this panel, I was thinking about what to talk about, what kind of title would I give to my talk, and I thought about talking about the unspeakability of this crime and oral history. Because through the Oral History project that I co-founded and I direct in Kosovo, I have interviewed several women's activists who kind of opened a whole world for me in terms of how to think about sexual violence and the silence that surrounded it, because we all know that this is one of the crimes that is most underreported in the world. And certainly in Kosovo, which is the area where I focus more in my research, it's a crime that hasn't been spoken about, and survivors have not been coming forward and telling their stories as much as we would have liked to know what really happened. So I did research and I focused on this topic. I will try to say something about it. Whatever I don't manage to say, you can read in the article that was just published online by East European Politics and Societies, and it's called "Seeking Justice for Wartime Sexual Violence in Kosovo: Voices and Silence of Women." We always talk about, and we're right, that this crime is surrounded by silence, but actually is also very much spoken about and very much represented. You just have to go to any museum hall of 19th century or of modern art or classic European art, and you see rape depicted very often. Just look at Rubens or look at Delacroix. And I mean, I was thinking about Delacroix because I recently taught about the independence war of Greece, and you can see how rape is really linked to the subjection of a nation or a community. So just rape is talked a lot about by perpetrators and by victims. But what was really interesting is to find out how is it talked about, why is it talked about or not, and who does the talking. In Kosovo, the issue of rape was very much talked about at the beginning of the 90s. The war in Yugoslavia didn't start in Bosnia, unfortunately. It started in Kosovo with the revocation of the autonomy of Kosovo by Milosevic in 1989, and with the establishment of martial law in Kosovo. Rapes began to happen there in the beginning of the 90s, and has one of the person I interviewed, Sevdi Akmeti, who's a longtime activist and women's rights activist, said the war in Yugoslavia began as a war against women. Throughout the late 80s, for instance, the Serbian press and media were saturated with attacks against Albanians in Kosovo, depicted as villains and rapists of Serbian women, and Albanian women described as washing machines and breeders, because Kosovo had a very high birth rate, which was more connected to the economic condition of the area, of the country, as we all know, much more than to culture. So the war really started in Kosovo with this huge attack against Albanian women, and with a lot of talk about rape. And rape was happening, and women were reporting it, not just the women who were survivors of rape, but also the activists. And this is another thing. Sometimes survivors do not openly speak about rape, but there are spokespersons for them. There are the women women's rights activists who side with them, who help them, who kind of bring to light the crimes and the violences committing against women. And these were Vjosa Dobruna, doctor, Sevdia Kmeti, she was a librarian. They started reporting rape, and they split from the human rights organization they were working with, which was the Albanian Human Rights Organization, the Council for the Defense of Freedoms and Human Rights, because the men in that organization didn't want to talk about rape. They considered women collateral damage in the war. And so any violence that women were subjected to was described as maltreatment of XY. Their names were not given. Very often we say maltreatment of XY's wife, XY's daughters. So they were kind of, the violence that was committed against these women was described as something that had actually a damage to the men who owned these women. And Vjosa and Sevdia said, no, we have to actually describe this and call it by its name. This was possible for them to see. These are kind of feminist anti-literum. The feminist movement was not that strong in Kosovo. But this is 92, 93. 92, we all know that Bosnian women, the first refugees, were arriving in Croatia, and that was there, in fact, a huge network of feminist women who brought to light the crime that was committed in Bosnia. And that was also received in Kosovo as information. Also, refugees were coming to Kosovo, were pushed to Kosovo by Milosevic from Foča and Bijeljina, and these women brought their stories with them. They were talking, so women were talking about this. The Albanian women who were raped were talking about this. There are photos of the physical violence that they received, collected by the Human Rights Organization and by the women who were collecting this information. How do they talk about that? They talked about that, it's interesting that Madeline Rees yesterday said something similar. They talk about that sometimes in an indirect way. For instance, they said, well, I've been asked to make coffee by Serbian soldiers. And that was understood as actually that she was asked for much more. But that's the way they talk about that, and it was understood and was reported as sexual violence by the women. How did these reports, how this reporting was conducted was also a story in itself of gender, gender manipulation and appropriation. I mean, I find it very interesting to hear that the women who were going in the field, it was very dangerous during the war in Kosovo, to collect information about human rights violation, dressed herself up and used a lot of makeup to represent their own stereotype of Serbian women. It would be perceived as more, more aggressive and more. They use this word, more vulgar and more aggressive. Where Albanians, their own stereotype of Albanian women of being more modest and more, housebound. So the Albanian women who went in the field and faced the Serbian checkpoints and the Serbian army pretended to be Serbian. So they could do it because they spoke Serbian fluently. Some of them were blonde and wore miniskirts and were aggressively there to, in fact, do a different type of work. Also, this was done. So all the collection of documentation of sexual violence during the war was done against the Albanian leadership, the male Albanian leadership, because they thought that a national cause was more important than the reporting of violence against women. It was done also because at the same time, and here is who talks about these issues, at the same time, we're getting now to 95, there was the Beijing Conference of Women, in which violence against women became became paramount of the organization of transnational networks of women and women's movement. So it was possible for the Kosovo women who were collecting this evidence to also bring it to the fore in Beijing and to feel part of a broader movement, broader advocacy, they spoke openly about violence against women. Well, what happened later is another story. Also, talking about rape and survivors, talking about what happened to them, was still possible during the war because the KLA appropriated this discourse, as I've been told by women who were there, and they made this like they used this as a narrative capital, between quote, to use an expression by Thaydon. She wrote about this in her work on the Peru Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The violence against women in Kosovo was represented as an attack on the whole nation, which was, in part, but it was the narrative capital of the liberation war of the KLA, and men also talk about this and gave information to the media to amplify the crimes that Milosevic was committing in Kosovo and to advocate for NATO intervention. All this stopped after the war. After the war, when UNMIK took over the administration of Kosovo, the UN mission in Kosovo, Sevdi Ahmeti gave the head of police of UNMIK police 37 cases, all fully documented, of sexual violence. And these cases, they just were put in the drawer and never looked at. Actually, there was a joke that was that we had when I worked in Kosovo and about UNMIK, the legal council of UNMIK had a table where we call the table of death because all the documentation that was sent to him would just died on that table. And that was the case of UNMIK. This is very serious because, if we think that the United Nations is the protector and defender of human rights all over the world, what women experience in Kosovo, the survivors and their spokesperson, the women's activists, they experience a wall. They experience lack of support, and this erosion of trust in institutions that could have helped them began then and there. It was amplified by other things, despite the 1325 resolution, there was actually kind of thought about and designed during the Kosovo events. Not many women, and I'm using a euphemism, were part of the international administration of Kosovo, and not many women were heard. When Iqbal Ergova, a woman activist, went to the NATO commander and said, we know that there will be women's trafficking in Kosovo because we know that it happened in Bosnia. We know the circumstances in which this phenomenon takes place. A large number of soldiers, borders that don't exist, climate, huge, violence. So we know, what are you going to do about it? And the NATO commander looked at her and says, don't bother me with this. And she insisted that at the end, he walked out. We walked out of her and said, boys will be boys. You take care of your girls. Well, that's that didn't go very well. Of course, as you can imagine, there was trafficking of women in Kosovo. There was violence against women even after the end of the war. And the survivors and their spokesman and their spokesperson decided not to talk about this because there was no reason for them to talk in public about what they had experienced, because there was absolutely no redress to be had, no justice, and no sympathy. As it always happens, also the society was not really sympathetic to it. It became a big elephant in the room. We need to understand that a lot of rapes were committed in front of the families. Husbands or fathers or the men in the families often were killed, but a lot of rapes were known to the community, to the close community of women, but they couldn't talk about that even within the family because of stigma, because of shame, and because there was also nowhere else where they could go but their own community. I need to rapidly close, so I'm going to just point to a few other things. They also were silenced because when they were called to testify at the ICTY as protected witnesses, their identity was revealed. And the three of them who did it, in the case of sexual violence, it was also followed by killing. And someone told me, one of these women I interviewed said, you know, Serbs had learned their lesson from Bosnia, so they often killed the women that they raped, so there wouldn't be any testimony. So when these women went to testify, they had to not only confront Milosevic, but also had to confront their identity being revealed to their community, and they finally asked and obtained relocation in a third country, but they had to abandon Kosovo. After that, nobody else testified at The Hague on any case of sexual violence. And what women have done, they have talked a lot about rape among themselves. With the women who work with them and provided medical and psychological help. So there's been a lot of talk about rape, but only among people who survivors could trust and could have the support from. If you've been yesterday at our event, what happened has been a big transformation after 2012, where again, after how many years? 14 years since the war. Women's organization held an 8th of March demonstration with a new type of banner. They call it, they said, we don't want flowers, we want justice. And that reopened the discussion about rape because important women, women in power, the president, the Minister for European Integration, met with survivors privately, heard their stories, and committed to do something about them. That's why now in Kosovo there is a law that provides kind of a pension for survivors of sexual violence as civilian victims of the war. And that's why the president sponsored the art installation Thinking of You that collected 5,000 dresses and exposed them, displayed them in the football stadium of Pristina during a 1-month campaign in which rape was talked about, violence against women was talked about in the media every day across Kosovo, and this became a big opening. The last thing I want to say is that last week, Prince Charles and the Duchess of Cornwall visited Kosovo, and for the first time, I mean, they were taken to visit also survivors. Survivors. Kosovo is a small place where the presidents and popes go and visit everybody, but they never visited survivors. And this is the first time that someone of that stature visited survivors, and the Duchess has been reported to have cried listening to their story and renewing their commitment to fight sexual violence, which is already expressed in separately. So this is a crime that now in Kosovo is being spoken more, not the ideal place, but survivors feel that now they have much more of a free space in which they can tell their stories. And thank you for listening.
Velma?
Thank you so much. So hello everybody, thank you for coming. Before I started, I would like to say thanks to Tanya, first of all, for bringing me from Sarajevo here and the Harman Institute. It's a great privilege to be among my dear colleagues. So I have a few slides, and so, as I mentioned, my name is Velma Saric, and I'm a founder and executive director of the Post-Conflict Research Center. And that is an innovative peace-building organization based in Sarajevo, which aims to cultivate an environment for sustainable peace in Bosnia and the greater Balkan region. So, today I'm going to share some of my expertise in the area of sexual violence and conflict, as well as data which my center has collected over 5 past years of active work related to this topic. Issues of gender equality and women empowerment are not prioritized in a dominant political agenda in the public process in Bosnia. The marginalization of women with the public process has led to a deficit of effective female role models for young people especially, and those wishing to initiate a social change. With such an environment, gender inequalities combined with other inequalities and social exclusion can create several problems. In Bosnia, this primarily relates to unique challenges faced victims of wartime and other forms of sexual violence. Female survivors of wartime, rape and sexual violence generally felt the state neglected their experience and tries to avoid addressing their responsibilities toward them. Many other issues regarding wartime victims remained unsolved almost 20 years after the war. In the case of Bosnia, rape was used as a weapon of war on a massive scale. The practice of rape was organized and severe. While women were primarily the targets of rape, men were also subjects of sexual violence and rape too. An European investigation team estimated that between April 1992 and January 1993, some 200,000 Bosnian women were raped. These estimates have been highly disputed, and other estimates claim that number of raped women is high as 50,000, according to UN. Numerous reports allude the establishment of rape camps and systemized operations to forcibly impregnate women through repeated rape during being in rape camps. It has been argued that rape camps themselves were built to attack collective identity of the targeted group. Victims of sexual violence and rape are currently in Bosnia, they need a various type of support, including psychological, mental, financial, and state support. These crimes often are hidden, and many of them were never reported. The women victims of sexual violence and rape often must rely on their families for support. Through my professional work and the work of the Post-Conflict Research Center, we organize and develop a series of multimedia creative educational projects that aim to stop impunity for perpetrators and promote the legal prosecution for those responsible for these crimes. This is the mission. So, our first goal by organizing these projects was to raise awareness about the issue of sexual violence in conflict and help to overcome the stigma associated with such crimes. So first goal was stopping impunity for perpetrators and legal procedure of those responsible. It is shocking that from 20 to 50,000 instances of sexual crimes, Bosnia only seen about 70 final convictions till now. In June 1996, the International Tribunal, and yesterday we heard this, so I'm going to repeat it just shortly. International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY, issued an indictment against 8 Bosnian Serbs, soldiers who were enslavement and rape Muslim women in eastern Bosnian town Foča during the 1992 till 1993. My connection with this judgment and this case is through, I work as a Bosnian producer for the documentary episodes of PBS, Syria, Women, War and Peace. I came to testify, and it's actually speaking about the braveness of Bosnian women from Foča and how they decided they will stand on the court and testify. We know that this led to that after this rape became crime against humanity. So this is one of the projects on which we are extremely proud as an organization. The second is Uspomene 677. Anna and some people had a chance to see them on Monday at New York University. But Uspomene explores the experience of survivors of concentration and rape camps from all 3 ethnic groups and their struggle to overcome the stigma which they are dealing in a daily life. Our second goal was raising awareness and fighting the stigma. With Bosnia, in a case, and as a case in many other countries, survivors of rape are fighting extreme stigmatization. they can find very difficult to achieve recognition and respect from society in which they live. These survivors often feel that they are carrying the burden of sin on their shoulders. In other words, after years of silence, family members and others that they are close to them are sometimes blaming the victims. Some women even wonder, maybe it is true that in some way it is my fault. With regard to the reporting of sexual violence and related crimes, the stigmatization often stops the victims for coming forward, and through this, many times rape goes unreported. The result in the victims is then the result is not having any kind of support or assistance. So PCRC have been working on a numbers of gender-related issues, and it have been able to build a strong network of connections with the various stakeholder groups. Behind my back, you can see the photo with Angelina Jolie and survivors of Bosnian war, because from 2011 till 2012, we have been working directly with UN Goodwill Ambassador Angelina Jolie on her work related to the film In the Land of Blood and Honey. Our work helped her to establish a network among victims, associations, and NGOs. We were helping her with research, and we also facilitated a personal meeting between survivors and Mrs. Jolie when the film was screened in Sarajevo. We also organized her premiere because Mrs. Jolie then delivered 2,500 tickets to survivors and NGOs activists. So my professional work on investigation of war crimes and sexual violence is going even further, because I did work for Institute for War and Peace Reporting for 8 years. And through this work, I wrote more than 300 reports from proceedings, including the trials of Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic, which did increase access to transitional justice process. In November 2014, my organization worked in collaboration with the British government and British Embassy in Bosnia to launch the International Protocol on Documentation and Investigation of Sexual Violence. One of our main roles was to host a series of panel discussion across the country, focused on raising awareness of the challenges faced by Bosnian survivors of sexual violence. These events gather survivors, psychologists, activists, and youth to discuss a range of topics that include lack of support, recognition given to victims, and stigmatization which survivors face on a daily basis. Over 500 representatives of civil society organizations, victims, associations of international organizations attend these events, as well local government officials and the member of general public. But some of the most important people in the public were local high schools and university students that we involved. I will quote Natasha, student from Banja Luka, who said that I'm here today to support the victims of those who went through such a horror and torture. I believe if we don't overcome the Republika Srpska main problem of politicizing everything, including issues regarding victims of war, then we will never be able to move forward. We will always be stuck where we are right now. That is worrying me as a young person who lives in Republika Srpska. What also we were able to notice is that, for example, young people, they had more knowledge about rape in Africa than about rape in their own country. They were really ignorant toward these things. And these are kind of issues that we wanted to young people to explore and be involved with. As PCRC is working to ensure that young people are becoming more actively involved in the conversation. We did this in two ways. We were using, as I mentioned, we use multimedia and educational programming. So we have several different exhibitions like Warriors of Peace, My Body a War Zone, and Hasia's story. I will move forward because this is the second more important part. In 2015, we established a formal partnership with ICTY. As I stated before, Tribunal has played a historical role in prosecution of war sexual violence. So we did several, through collaboration with the ICTY, we tend to educate young people about the ICTY role in the transitional justice. and to take their findings on the ground. We did several workshops with the Bosnian and Balkan youth in order to test their knowledge and interest. And most of these young people know little about it. But once they have been engaged in this topic, they were really active, and they wanted to ask questions, they wanted to find more and get involved. So I will go to, since we are short with time, I will go to the future steps and recommendations, because what I'm thinking that is extremely important in the case of Bosnia, but probably in other post-conflict countries, is first to work on establishing a systematic political dialogue. This dialogue would help to resolve the problem of reparation which victims of Bosnia are dealing with. We have laws in in federal part, and the victims of war can claim a compensation as civil victims of war, but women in Republika Srpska cannot do it. So that would resolve a big problem. The push forward the implementation of the war crimes strategy from 2008, which emphasized that cases of sexual violence should be proceed at the state level. And that is really important. I'm mentioning this because many times these sensitive cases, they have been transferred to the local courts, and local courts don't even have capacity to proceed. Many times perpetrators and victims are sitting in the same courtroom. So this is the second one. Secure socio-economical and psychological support. The second thing would be a work on establishing a platform for documentation sexual violence as a weapon of war. Not all of these crimes which took place will proceed, but that doesn't mean the state is not obligated to provide compensation to the victims. What is really, really necessary is also to create a platform for documenting these crimes so that they can once be entered into the history's country books. There is no other way that we can prevent manipulation and denial, because sexual violence is being swept under the rug and is being presented it was in the process of dehumanization. And the third one is to work on raising awareness and educational activities that they will bring together female and male victims to jointly discuss their experiences related to stigma and the lack of support they have. It is important to shed a light on and talk about stigma and talk about these people. Through this work we can provide a basic so that we can help these women and men, because Bosnia also had significant number of men. And I mentioned yesterday, I think that protocol and the whole initiative also brought incredible fact that Balkans men who are really proud, and it's really difficult for them to speak about these kind of experience, they came out and they started to talk about rape. So I will mention that, human rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights once for all. So that is what actually we kind of need to have in mind when we are talking about Bosnian women. I think that they have been extremely courageous. So thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'll start with a short introduction. I'm Edita Miftari. I'm a feminist activist from Bosnia and Herzegovina. Currently doing my Fulbright research at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. And my area of interest is participation of women in peace talks, and actually how does exclusion of women from peace talks affect women's visibility and their presence in public and political life in the post-conflict societies. Today I will talk about, of course, about sexual violence in Bosnia, but I will try to not repeat what Velma said, and she actually delivered a really good presentation with a lot of information about the context, but also about the work of her organization. And I also tried not to talk a lot about legislation which actually planned, because I believe Jennifer will include that in her presentation. So I will try to provide a short context. I'll probably repeat a lot of stuff that sorry, that's already been said, but I also plan to kind of move the discussion towards how do we perceive women and women's bodies when it comes to sexual violence, especially in conflict. So about the context, so the war in Bosnia was marked by mass crimes, which initiated the debate on the establishment of international bodies for the prosecution of war crimes. So the rape in Bosnia-Herzegovina had its own local, regional, and international dimensions, and that experience has become relevant to women's history because sexual crimes were a part of the atrocities that occurred in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and as such, they became an element in women's activism, which advocated the protection of women in armed conflicts and defining mass rape as a crime against humanity. So rape was, for the first time in history, recognized as a war crime and a crime against humanity, since in the 90s, the atrocities committed against women during the war in Bosnia and also Rwanda have become more visible, and as a result of the pressure exerted by the feminist movements, not only from the region of Southeast Europe, but also at the international level. So the first trials for wartime sexual violence took place in the international arena, namely at the ICTY, which was established in May 1993. So based on the reports of mass rapes in Bosnia and information about rape camps, data were presented on how rape was used systematically as a weapon of war, especially for the purposes of genocide and ethnic expulsion. According to the findings of the team of the European Community Mission that Velma already mentioned, who were assessing the situation in 1992, there were 20,000 to 50,000 women who were actually raped during the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So I will move to discussion on about women's bodies as battlefields, and I really hope that this will kind of initiate questions that we could discuss after our presentations, because it is really important to kind of perceive these horrible acts against humanity and against women's bodies as they are, and not just as something that happens in war as inevitable. So we need to look into motives. Why is it actually happening, and what's the background of those kind of atrocities? So during the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the female body served as a symbolic space. It was used as a strategy to overpower the enemy signified by the woman's body and to achieve psychological and military objectives. For example, raping Muslim women functioned to demoralize Bosnian men and to dehumanize the women. So therefore, in 2006, rape was actually declared as a strategy of ethnic cleansing. What eventually proved to be a problem was reflected in the so-called phenomenon of the victim hierarchy, because ethnically based rape represents a new and more severe category than ordinary rape, and as such is interpreted as a threat to the nation rather than as an assault against a woman. So women's bodies were regarded as an arena for political contestation and thus dehumanized, politicized, and perceived as male space. So the patriarchal construction of women as political male space suggests that women are objects and that their bodies are battlefields in a contest between rival males. Warfare becomes a context of masculinity where the penis is weaponized and males fight to emasculate opponents by invading the bodies of their nation's women. The ethnic gene pool is thus contaminated by the appropriation and colonizing the nation's female bodies. This is because in patriarchy, the inability to protect one's woman and to control her sexual and procreative powers is recognized as a weakness in men. So by the logic of Michael Kimmel's 4 rules of manhood that state that femininity in any way, shape, or form actually invalidates masculinity, mass raping of ethnic women emasculates the man and feminizes the entire ethnicity, effectively weakening it beyond reconciliation. So therefore, non-Serb men were also humiliated and weakened because they failed to be reliable protectors when confronted by Serbs. They were unable to maintain the dominance and control of women that patriarchy commands. So it becomes clear that patriarchy is inherently homosocial as it concerns men and what goes on amongst them in their struggle for power, control, and domination. So misogyny and the oppression of women is an important part of patriarchy, but it's not the purpose. So the goal of patriarchy is to maintain male privilege and control of others. And Balkan patriarchy adopts genocidal rape as a tool to eradicate or at least subordinate the other. Eradication in Bosnian war lies at the nexus of ethnicity and gender, where a man's failure to fulfill his gender role is a reflection on his ethnic group. So I would just like to quickly move to because I've been asked to talk just a little bit about the recent progress that has been done in Bosnia. Well, what I consider progress is actually moving from the dead spot. Sometimes it's towards better. Sometimes it's just moving in one place, but still some sort of initiative is happening, obviously. And I will present the findings that we actually put in the Orange Report for 2015 that was published just a few weeks ago by the Saric Open Center, which is an organization that I actively work with in the past couple of years. So, for a start, in May 2015, the Parliamentary Assembly of Bosnia adopted the changes and amendments to the criminal law of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which finally harmonized the definition of rape and other forms of sexual violence committed as war crimes against the civilian population or crimes against humanity with international standards of the International Criminal Courts. So this is important because the old definition implied that the use of force or the threat of use of force were the only means available to determine that rape or other sexual activities occurred without consent. So on the other hand, international jurisprudence developed an approach according to which coercive circumstance can indicate the lack of consent, and the circumstances can be inherent in certain situations, for example, in armed conflict. Such circumstances imply lack of consent to the sexual activities when it's clear that the person was in a state of coercion, which precluded the very possibility of exercising their sexual autonomy. This way, the number of perpetrators who can be prosecuted in the future is widened, and because the obstacle of proof of the crime is removed. This change is also important in the context of deterrence from committing the crime in the first place, and so it has long-term potential and preventive functions. Another initiative that happened was, well, another positive actually progress that happened is in June 2015, the Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina reached significant, although appealable judgments in two cases against Slavko Savic and Vasilija Kenostoja Markovic, in which it was decided that in addition to jail time for the perpetrators, they were also obliged to pay the two victims of conflict-related sexual violence for the non-material damage they suffered. In one case, the sum was 30,000 convertible marks, and in other, it was 25,000, which is around $15,000 for the psychological harm suffered. Yes. Okay. For psychological harm suffered due to the restriction of liberty of rights of personality and harm suffered as a consequence of reduced life activity. So this was the first decision of this kind reached in the war crimes trial in Bosnia, and before these decisions, not a single victim of conflict-related sexual violence, nor victims of war crimes in general, had managed to get their right to compensation recognized within criminal cases, despite the rights they were given through the relevant provisions of the criminal law of Bosnia and Herzegovina on realizing property legal requests. And a few more things. On June 26, 2015, the Joint Commission for Human Rights of the Parliamentary Assembly of Bosnia held the first special session for International Day in Support of Torture Victims, and it was concluded that the Council of Ministers should prepare and put in the parliamentary procedure the draft law of the rights of victims of torture. By the end of 2015, they created a working group, and the work on the draft proposal actually started under the guidance of the Ministry of Human Rights and Refugees. So unfortunately, the draft was never forwarded to the Council of Ministers, and neither was it submitted to the Parliamentary Assembly, but the program of work of the Ministry of Human Rights and Refugees predict, for 2016, predict drafting next text of the rights, on the rights of victims of torture. Similar law has also been announced in Republika Srpska. Also, there was a change in the law on claiming the status of victim of conflict-related sexual violence. And although a wide range and systematic reform of the social services sector in the Federation of Bosnia have been announced, the government of Federation started working on changing and amending the existing law on the basics of social protection, protection of civilian victims of war, and the protection of families with children of Federation Bosnia and Herzegovina. So the draft law envisages the formation of a special commission by the Federal Ministry for Work and Social Policy, which should issue opinions on whether the claimant is a victim of sexual violence. So this serves to introduce a new and pretty much unnecessary body into the procedure rather than using the existing mechanisms, such as the official Institute for Medical Assessment of Health in the Federation. In addition to this, the entire process of reform of the social services sector has been conducted behind closed doors without communicating the details to the civil society organizations and their representatives. And finally, in 2015, the National Assembly of Republika Srpska discussed the findings and recommendations made in the study conducted by the Gender Center of Republika Srpska on the position of Serb women who were victims of war crime, victims of wartime sexual violence in Bosnia. Many civil society organizations welcomed the study, since the question, this question has been actually almost completely marginalized in the past 20 years. But on the other hand, the civil society organizations also pointed out that the findings of the study only related to the victims of a single ethnicity and not to all victims living in the territory of Republika Srpska. So Velma already mentioned, well, most of my recommendations that I actually prepared for the end of presentation, so I'm not going to repeat that because we basically agree on that. I just have a few takeaway points that I want you to kind of consider and remember from this presentation. We need to know that thousands of women and girls were raped, many of them systematically and repeatedly, and that in spite of international outrage and widespread media attention, very little has been done in Bosnia to ensure the survivors' right to justice, truth, and reparation. And while most perpetrators have never been brought to justice, the survivors of these crimes are still struggling to rebuild their shattered lives. And finally, and what I really want us to focus discussion on is how the women's bodies were used and how enemy non-Serb men within Bosnia and Herzegovina were feminized, and the bodies of women were rendered a political male space battlefield in a contest between rival males. Thank you.
Jennifer?
Thanks, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this terrific conference. So I'm going to switch focus to the work of the International Criminal Tribunals. So today we're hearing a lot of grim news from the field, and I think that'll continue in our next panel. But at least the bit of good news is that we have the legal tools to prosecute these crimes where there is the will, where there is the way, which doesn't always exist, but we do have this now. So the international tribunals, as you've heard a little, have brought groundbreaking cases. We have their prosecutions, we have their law, we have their expertise, but of course more needs to be done because ultimately, numerically, local courts will end up prosecuting most of these cases. And they need the resources and staff and will to carry on this legacy, because the international tribunals can't do it all. But what they have done is tremendously groundbreaking. And here I refer to the work of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. And as of this Monday, the International Criminal Court, with its first decision that crimes of sexual violence are war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Bemba case. So unfortunately, this groundbreaking jurisprudence was needed because of the rampant use of rape as a weapon of war in the former Yugoslavia and in the Rwandan genocide. And we've heard estimates of 20 to 50,000 women raped in the former Yugoslavia. Rwanda, 250,000 to 500,000 rapes. And another chilling statistic, 20,000 estimated children in Rwanda born to women as a result of rape, and I'm sure there must be similar statistics for the former Yugoslavia. So our first case to prosecute rape was actually the ICTR's case of Akiyezu, prosecuted as genocide and a war crime. ICTY has prosecuted rape as a war crime and crime against humanity. So these approaches to the crime of rape in and of themselves are tremendously significant, because our predecessor tribunals had largely ignored these kinds of crimes, and in the past rape was trivialized as an inevitable byproduct of war. So for the first time at these tribunals, they're receiving the significant attention that they're due. So saying that they are genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity is in itself a hugely powerful statement. So rape can be a form of genocide where it is part of the destruction of a certain specific targeted group. You might have noticed in the news, we have new allegations out that the use of rape and other crimes against, for instance, the Yazidis and others in potentially are genocide. So we will see how this will play out. Unfortunately, as we'll probably hear in our next panel, we don't yet quite have a tribunal that's going to hear this. But recognizing rape as a means of genocide is tremendously important. For instance, in Akiyezu, they talk about how it's a means of destroying the group. And there it was prosecuted as the underlying genocide crime of serious bodily or mental harm. It could also be deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its destruction. We have this discussed in the Kayashema case, and it may entail imposing measures intended to bring birth, as discussed in Akiyezu. Rape can be a crime against humanity where it's part of a widespread or systematic attack against the domestic population or a civilian population. Some tribunals require the showing of a plan or policy. And other underlying crimes in addition to rape that may also be present in these kinds of cases include enslavement, torture, persecution, and other inhumane acts. So we now at least have all of the law on this. For instance, in the Burjanin case, recognizing persecution, that rape was a form of persecution, and there they were looking at whether the requisite mental state was satisfied, and they looked to statements like Serbs wanting to impregnate Bosnian Muslims with little Serbs, and noting that reflected discriminatory intent. We have similar holdings regarding various of the camps. Omarska, Ternopolia, Karaterm. In the Stockich case, we have recognition also of rape as a war crime. There you need the showing of armed conflict and a nexus or connection between the rapes and the armed conflict. Relevant related acts may include outrages on personal dignity, such as humiliating and degrading treatment, enforced prostitution, and any other form of indecent assault. This is from the ICTR statute. And in ICTY, they focus on cruel treatment, outrages on personal dignity, willful confinement, and slavery. Rape also, importantly, has been recognized as a form of torture. One of our cases to do this is the Mucic case, focusing on Bosnian Serbs who are held in captivity in the prison camp in Celibici. There, the trials chamber stated, the rape of any person is a despicable act which strikes at the core of human dignity and physical integrity. The condemnation and punishment of rape becomes all the more urgent where committed by a public official. Rape causes severe pain and suffering, both psychological and mental. Psychological suffering of the persons may be exacerbated by social and cultural conditions, and particularly acute and long-lasting. It's difficult to envision it committed by the instigation of a public official where it does not involve punishment, coercion, discrimination, or intimidation. These are situations inherent in armed conflict. And you have many other cases recognizing rape as a form of torture. The jurisprudence also recognizes sexual violence that falls short of rape per se, can be a variety of these crimes. It can be part of the serious bodily or mental harm that constitutes genocide. We have this in the Akiyezu, Saramba, Bagasora, Kamuhanda, and Rudaganda cases. Sexual violence short of rape can also fall under the crimes against humanity of torture, persecution, enslavement, or other inhumane acts. We have important jurisprudential firsts coming out of our tribunals. Their first case to focus entirely on sexual violence was the Furungia case. Furungia. Velma's trying to help me with my Bosnian pronunciation. There was commander of the Jokers, a special Croatian Defense Council unit was prosecuted for rape. The second case already referred to has focused on the Bosnian town of Foča. It's the Kunarac case. The ICTY also brought our first ever prosecution of horrific acts of sexual violence perpetrated by men against men. It is the Tadic case, and there a particularly heinous act committed in the Omarska camp was found to be cruel treatment and other inhumane acts, war crimes and crimes against humanity. Similar holdings of sexual violence against men in the Česić, Mučić, Todorović, Simić cases, and ICTR's Nijetegeka. Along with the substantive crimes, we have a lot of other helpful jurisprudence, such as that the rapist knew the victim and may have had some personal motivation does not preclude finding rape. Force or threat of force proves non-consent, but force is not an element of rape in the Bagasora case. The circumstances prevailing in most genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity cases is almost universally coercive. In these circumstances, true consent is not possible, and that's Gakumbitsi and Muhumana, and other cases as well from the ICTY. It's not necessary to introduce evidence of the victim's words, conduct, or relationship to the perpetrator, Gakumbitsi. The status of detention normally vitiates consent, Kvoka. Resistance by the victim and force by the perpetrator are not required elements. Corroboration is not required. And the prior sexual conduct of the victim, at least at the ICTY, by rule, and the Mučić case, is inadmissible to the court. All of these are helpful to proving these cases. At the ICC, I'll just briefly mention that already the Rome Statute is very helpful. It doesn't just list rape, but sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy, enforced sterilization, or any other form of sexual violence of comparable gravity can be crimes against humanity. Rape and sexual violence crimes could still be genocide, although not expressly enumerated, and rape can be a war crime along with sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy, enforced sterilization, and any other form of sexual violence. So before you think that these were just inherent outgrowths of the tribunals, I have to say that there was much lobbying done to get our tribunals to this point. Early on, for instance, in the life of the Rwanda tribunal, it was found that sexual violence crimes were missing from many of the indictments. And our keynote referred to one incident. I heard it told a slightly different way, that the judge on the stand said, prosecutor, your motion to add rape charges is hereby granted. Well, the prosecutor had made no motion. She was saying, look, there's rape in this case, we're hearing about it, and you, inattentive prosecutor, don't even have it in your indictment. I suggest you add it. After this point, they went back and tried to add rape to various of the indictments. And it's thought that they initially very much overlooked this crime because they had sent largely male investigative teams into Rwanda. So they were picking up underreporting of the crime. Similarly, at the ICC, we have a very progressive statute, but this doesn't happen without lobbying. And we have very active NGO lobbyists at the international level in The Hague as well, such as Women's Caucus for Gender Justice. But there is some criticism that this issue has largely been taken over by women's rights groups, and it's suggested that that is resulting in men and boys who have been raped being too much ignored, and it's really surfacing that they are significant victims of these crimes as well. And there's been a bit of ownership of this issue by women's rights group, and this has created something of a one-sided effect. Now, the tribunals now have these tremendous legal tools, but they can't do it all. Unfortunately, we have to leave it to the courts in the region. They face a myriad of challenges. We've heard about some of them. We have local courts doing war crimes cases in the former Yugoslavia, some more or less successfully. Rwanda as well, numerically, most of the cases have gone to their domestic courts. Rape was originally categorized as a Category 1 offense, but then shifted over into the gacaca process, so numerically that's where most of the cases were. Looking to the future, massive challenges remain, both to create future tribunals for countries such as Syria, South Sudan, Sri Lanka. We should have had a tribunal long ago for DRC. Because it's still very difficult to prosecute these crimes, but at least we have the legal tools. So I will end by saying where the progress made has been absolutely historic, but unfortunately it hasn't silenced, it hasn't prevented the perpetrators from committing these crimes. So we need more and more prosecutions. And we need the political will to make sure that local war crimes prosecutions are sufficiently funded, they have sufficient capacity, and they bring these cases as well, because numerically they're going to have to do most of them. Ultimately, what we need is to stop these crimes. Maybe someday when we have enough prosecutions, would-be perpetrators will be deterred. We're not there, but at least we have the foundations for these prosecutions.
Thank you, all of you. I appreciate the contributions. I'm sorry I sort of kept them limited because I want to give the audience a chance to ask questions, and then you guys can expand on what you were saying in your remarks. So does anybody have any questions, thoughts for the panel?
Hi, thank you everyone for your comments. They were really insightful. Velma, you mentioned documentation of these abuses that are still going on today. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the documentation, and specifically who's conducting the documentation, and if and how they're working with police and justice sectors in Bosnia.
Well, I mentioned documentation because for me that is, it's a key actually for preventing manipulation and denial. Unfortunately, up till now, we don't have a centralized databases which will kind of, provide you access toward any kind of crimes, not just rape and sexual violence. If we talk about, for example, the numbers of people who have been killed during the Bosnian War, it's still kind of subject of manipulation because you cannot access the data. Only project which was, let's say, successful, and it was highly supported by international community, the Bosnian Book of Dead, done by Research Documentation Center, led by Mr. Tokacha, is not public. Is not, like you cannot access this data. You can buy the few books, like few part of books, and then, for researchers and people who want to kind of, access data online, it's extremely complicated. So I'm kind of urging even now on this center to provide these databases available. And unfortunately, up till now, every ethnic side have its own databases on some ways. So there is certain databases in a center of documentation and war in Republika Srpska. There is certain databases in Institute for Research Crime Against Humanity, but this have been, let's say, done through, like ethnic or national agendas. So it's still not something what would be kind of good for using. And especially victims of rape, nobody actually knows. Several different NGOs, Victims Association have their own data. So maybe the only one which can be kind of relevant is the databases which Court of Bosnia have, National Court. And I know that they are working on an extensive scale to collect this, but it have been big problem. It have been big problem in every level, not just rape. We don't know how many people have been killed up till now in the Bosnian Balkan War. So
And if I may add, one of the CEDAW actually recommendations, one of the first CEDAW recommendations to Bosnia is actually to establish those kind of databases on a national level, especially because what Velma just said about nationalistic and ethnic agendas. So none of the information that is currently available is actually objective, you know. So everyone has their own numbers, and they are making them bigger and bigger without any, you know, substantial proof. So yeah, so I just wanted to say that CEDAW was actually CEDAW committee recommended to Bosnia to establish that as soon as possible.
Jennifer, you said that most of the tribunal work will actually be done locally by local courts. So will an international court sort of help them figure out what they're doing before they start this? Because wouldn't that kind of lead to local courts not really knowing the full extent of what they should be doing?
Yeah, and this process has been going on. It was really the recognition of the completion strategy of the ICTY. For instance, they realized we need to try to help the local courts with these prosecutions, and I believe there's been significant amounts of exchange and programs held and work with particularly the state court in Bosnia between the ICTY. When I was last in the ICTY building, there were the registrar of a special court in Uganda was visiting that day. I mean, courts, we have this tremendous expertise, and there is an effort. There are a lot of best practices manuals. So the Yugoslav Tribunal just published their new best practice manual on prosecuting sexual gender-based violence crimes. So there are a lot of tools that we now have had from these groundbreaking cases, and it's working with local jurists and local prosecutors to build up capacity. Many times also maybe building witness protection from the start, because that's, you know, it's a necessary component. Various countries don't even have it. It's been referred to a particular problem in the local courts in Bosnia, elsewhere. So building the capacity. At least we have these tools, and we have the international expertise, and I think they can be harnessed to help these prosecutions.
Thank you. Yesterday we spoke a little bit about the role of women in Kosovo in bringing about awareness about sexual violence in the Thinking of You documentary. And I was wondering if Edita could just speak a little bit about the role of women in the political sphere in Bosnia about bringing awareness to this.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Well, actually, yesterday, for you who weren't at the film screening, I was actually fascinated by the women's leadership in Kosovo that actually supported the project Thinking of You. And I actually well, I'm so sorry Anna is not here. She had to leave, but I asked her how does she think that women's leadership in political and diplomatic sphere was actually supportive of the project itself. How did that kind of bring the whole nation and the society to be supportive of women survivors of rape? And actually she agreed that it was of the utmost importance. On the other hand, what we have in Bosnia, and since I have to connect it, since I'm doing this research on exclusion of women from peace talks, well, actually not including women in peace talks in Bosnia, and its effect on wherever the women are today when it comes to public and political life, and they're basically nowhere. And just until up to like 2 years ago, and the general elections 2014, our Council of Ministers on a national level didn't have any women. So we could be compared with other countries such as Saudi Arabia, for example, which was absolutely, unacceptable when it comes to women's political participation. considering that in Saudi Arabia, until like a year ago, women couldn't even vote. So we have this problem with political participation, and with that, of course, comes the advocacy on like official advocacy towards the parliament and representation of women and women's issues in parliament. And just recently we published a book, in Saric Open Center published a book, I'm one of the co-authors, about women's politics in Bosnia in the last 20 years. And actually what we concluded with the, I mean, the book itself wasn't really an analysis of women politics, but only because there was no women's politics. We don't have women's politics. We don't have such thing. We have women in politics, but that is far away from women's politics. So all of this kind of explains why, as women politicians, we don't have actually real representatives of survivors of sexual violence in wars, such as Kosovo had in their president and other, well, her team of women, first and foremost women who actually work with her. So I think that women's leadership in political way is actually really important in that sort of speaking.
Velma, do you have anything to add to that?
I completely agree with, so yeah.
Any other? I have a question, actually. Both of you sort of mentioned, I think, or touched on the question of these issues being co-opted by nationalist narratives. So I'm wondering if there's how you can sort of work against that. And sort of maybe a related question is, to what extent is there work across ethnicities on sexual violence issues, which is one way of, I think, combating that nationalist framework. So one of you maybe can start. Yeah.
I'll just say, because I'm looking to all sides, and yeah, okay. So it is kind of known that women in Bosnia were the first to cross ethnic lines, and not actually just after the war, but during the war. In the midst of conflict, women were ones who were actually crossing the ethnic lines, exchanging information, helping each other, and being very supportive to each other. So one of the first organizations, NGOs or civil society organizations that were actually established, again, in the midst of conflict in Zenica, was actually Medica Zenica, who were offering how do I translate it? Yeah, psychosocial therapy for survivors of sexual violence. So in that terms, women were actually the first to kind of combat those like ethnic and nationalist agendas, right? So if we talk from the perspective of, like, from present perspective, and we actually had a discussion last night, I think, from my point of view, it's actually worse than it was in the second half of the 90s, because we don't have the armed conflict anymore, but we are definitely in conflict. We are in ethnic conflict, and it's getting worse and worse, and the ethnic tensions are actually just growing, and a lot. Again, in my opinion, it's our politicians are actually the biggest problem. So, I mean, whether the women would like make a change or not, that remains to be seen, obviously. But when it comes to those overcoming those kind of agendas and those kind of tensions, agendas in terms of what we were talking earlier, I think it's going to be very, very hard. It's going to take a lot of time. Yeah.
So I will mention what we do through the Post-Conflict Research Center, because this is extremely sensitive topic, and everybody have its own story or its own side. So what we do through our multimedia educational programs, we are trying to bring the stories of other cases, Rwanda, Cambodia, or because we do see that young people can emphasize on the global level when is not directly touching their own ethnic or religious background, if they see that it's a global suffering, that is why I mentioned these exhibitions. Those are women from Nepal, Cambodia, Bangladesh, Northern Ireland, and if you provide them opportunity to teach about some other genocide or some other cases of sexual violence, then they can maybe develop empathy. We also are extremely sensitive toward whom we are bringing to our public debates, because we know that many times, unfortunately, victims associations and representatives are the tool of political manipulation. So we are always looking for those women who are not in a public, who are like ordinary women and who can relate with the suffering of other ethnic group. I couldn't screen video, and I mentioned yesterday protocol and this initiative because I couldn't screen video, but we have, you know, women from all sides sitting together and speaking about their pain and suffering and showing that they are dealing with the same problems. That is why I mentioned systematic political dialogue, because we first need to give them reparations. That is what we need to do. And it's hard, but there is a way, and yes, maybe it's on a grassroots level, but we need to start it from something. So film, photography, ICTY, I mean, it's also a problem of, you know, like many times we have a lot of initiatives and we multiply that effort instead of working together. So why to create something when ICTY already exists, and we just need to take the findings and the legacy, and so that is how we do. I mean, we are trying. I don't want to say that we are so successful, but there are some results, so.
Any other?
Thank you all very much. This is terrific. My question is, yesterday when we were just talking, one of the things that Madeline brought up is, as we all know, we have the legal framework, as Jennifer has pointed to. We have the legal jurisprudence, and if we have the political will, we can prosecute, and we can jail, and we can imprison. However, as we all know, rape, just because we have the laws doesn't mean that they're utilized, and as you've indicated, there are challenges at the national level. And so outside of that legal framework, my question is, with respect to reparations and the efforts to have reparations delivered, and that's a problem in Republika Srpska, in Bosnia's case, is that 20 years on, my fear is that these survivors, and I will not call them victims, they were victimized, but they survived to this. If they have lived, they have survived in some shape, form, or fashion. My concern is their isolation. And so the engagement on the socioeconomic level, when you look at Bosnia right now, 40% formal unemployment, up to 60% with youth. We know that a lot of women are single heads of household, and I just can't even imagine what that is like on a daily basis. So in your engagement and maybe advocacy, I'm wondering, beyond reparations, just comprehensive social, economic issues, because they are haunting the Bosnian political environment, you know. Mm-hmm. After 2014, the uprising, you know, the baby ID problem, you know, there's been just episodic and continuous problems in the socioeconomic realm of the country. And as young women, as the new generation, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I wanted you both here, is like, can you talk about that and how you can address that in the context of sexual violence? But overall, people seem to be very isolated. It's just an observation.
It's completely true. What was fascinating for me yesterday is also to see Anna's film, because you could feel the sense of pride when these women would brought those dresses, and that is exactly what Bosnia was missing. Like, it's really sad to mention that, you know, Jasmila Žbanić is probably the first person who broke the story with her film Grbavica. And if you're looking like the condition, filmmakers did more than government for these women, like art and, you know, using art as a tool. I mentioned I came to testify. It have been seen by 11 million people worldwide. I mentioned the Angelina Jolie film, and we were helping her because it's not about the plot. It was a lot of controversy around this film, and you know, then I was able to see how broken society is and how many issues these women are facing on a daily life. If they are, I mentioned how in Federation they are getting compensation and civil victims of war, but it's still atmosphere or situation where you would go to pay the bill for electricity and you would meet your rapist on another side working. Impunity, and how these women will come out. I mentioned strategy for war crime proceeding because our film Unprotected is showing a woman who was testifying against the man who killed her own family and he raped her, and he got 14 years. They have been together in the same room for half an hour, and she have been protected witness by state agency. 15 cameras around. When she came home, they immediately started to call her on the phone. So they want women to speak about it. They want them to, you know, come out from the dark and silence and stuff. But they are not providing any system or any support. And society also, you know, we need to raise awareness, especially young Balkans men need to know about these crimes and possibility that if sometimes there is a war or something, that they can be prosecuted and there are judgments, because we need to raise new generation of men and boys who will have more sensitivity. So that is what my observation is.
I can say something from an activist point of view. Well, Madeleine Rees was here yesterday, and her organization, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, has this initiative called Women in Bosnia and Syria Organizing for Change. And that, I will explain why I'm mentioning this. I was part of that initiative until the moment I actually left Bosnia and came here for the Fulbright. But I was part of it. I was attending the workshops that they've been doing, including the workshops on reparations, where we actually had Professor Ruth Rubio from Italy. She was actually giving us very good lectures. Anyways, so the point of the initiative was actually to bring Syrian Bosnian women together, so Bosnian women could, not just for Syrian women to kind of exchange experience and to help them with whatever they're going through as we speak. And one of the biggest problems when the initiative actually started was that Syrian women were excluded from peace talks. But also for Bosnian women to reflect on the last 20 years of their activism, of their participation in public and political life, on their participation or actual lack of it when it comes to peace talks. So that reflection, and I'm mentioning this in the context of what you asked, Tanya, about isolation. We have a really strong, I can't say that we have a women's movement, let alone feminist movement. We don't have that. But we do have a strong community of women from all across the country that are still together and have been together in the last 20 years, regardless of their differences, ethnic, nationalist, etc., etc. So that kind of getting together, that kind of community, these kind of initiatives that WILF is doing, and there have been many, many more, are actually, from my point of view, helping to fight the isolation. But again, from my point of view, I don't know what that actually means. I was born in 1989. I have no idea, and I can't even say that I know how it's like. to be raped or to be raped in war. So that is something that where I'm actually keeping the distance. I'm trying to help as much as I can, but you know, understanding, such understanding is something totally different. So yeah.
If I could add just for a little bit on reparations, that I mean, obviously they're a crucial component to a country moving on in transitional justice, but Yugoslav and Rwanda tribunals are kind of our first generation tribunals, and our newest, our predominant institution at this point is the International Criminal Court, and it actually has reparations capacity. So I'd say the jury's still out a little bit on how well this is going to work. But tribunals can be empowered to grant reparations, and this is an alternate way to go. Rather than waiting for national reparations to work, it can be done at the international level.
And I think we need to wrap it up. I thank you guys very much for your presentations, and thank you for being here. And yeah, I think we have a coffee break now.
Yeah, coffee break.
Thank you.
11 o'clock.
Thank you.
And then the next panel.
Thank you so much.